There may be some differences in kind and degree, but essentially we're facing the same problems you are in Toronto. The way it's described in Toronto is we now have a strong desire in the real estate market for people to live in the pre-World War II city, virtually all of it, because it has greater transit, obviously, it has walkability, it has neighborhoods that have a lot of amenities close to hand. And so what we're seeing is a huge shift in geography where poverty is being exported to the inner suburbs. So the work of Dr. David Holchansky, which is probably known to many of you on the emergence of three cities, documented that very dramatically from 1970 to 2005. Thanks to the federal government, David cannot pursue that work. The loss of the long-form census has made it impossible for him to continue to do that kind of analysis, which is a very, very serious problem. So that being said, the response to that kind of polarization by geography has to be that to confront these irresistible forces of gentrification, if you want to call it that, the switch in population, we have to move to some fairly drastic measures to ensure that we have a mix of housing throughout the region to leverage the enormous housing boom that we're experiencing. And no less than Premier Kathleen Wynne last week in front of an audience of several hundred people was musing about inclusionary zoning or other such measures that would intervene in the market. And so what I'm going to talk about is one subset of that discussion about mix. It actually refers to one of the categories that Margaret identified this morning, which is the stock of social housing, co-op and public housing, and in this case, I'm talking about Regent Park. And this comes about because as a result of amalgamation, our Toronto Community Housing Corporation has inherited a portfolio of about 55,000 housing units in various projects throughout the amalgamated city of Toronto, and they have potential to be densified and to increase both the amount of affordable housing, but also to increase housing generally in some very strategic locations. And Regent Park is kind of a flagship in that effort. And so I'm going to shift, for those purposes, I'm going to shift the discussion, as you will see, from house, which is the title of your symposium this morning, to neighborhood. And hopefully, although this is one very particular case, it may raise some issues, some possibilities that would be valuable for you in circumstances here. So my involvement here begins in the fall of 2002. This follows on the heels of about 15 years of failed efforts to do a revitalization project in Regent Park for various reasons, largely because the efforts were too partial. And so we had a very dynamic director of Toronto Community Housing at that time, Derek Ballantyne, who may be known to some of you, who really kind of pushed this over the top, brought me in with a team to have a fresh look at this. And so if you look back very quickly, what you'll see is that Regent Park occupied an area on the east side of downtown, very similar to all the rest of the neighborhood fabric around it, in fact, almost identical to Cabbagetown, which was not touched, but this was part of a huge area of the city center that was scheduled for urban renewal. And so the housing reformers of the day, extremely well-intentioned people and extremely misguided, had this idea that if you demolished the whole neighborhood, which they demonized, they thought it was the neighborhood that was the problem, the form of the city, the streets, the blocks, the houses, which have become these very expensive houses in Cabbagetown now. If they got rid of that and replaced it, that would solve all manner of problems. And there's a very touching video, which I don't have time to show you, which I would urge you to look up on YouTube, called Farewell to Oak Street, narrated by Lorne Green. National Film Board video. It's about 9 minutes long, 1952, which speaks in extraordinary terms to how folks in those days saw the world. So this is what it looked like. It was similar to so many other neighborhoods in the heart of Toronto, and the response was a kind of extremely derivative, minimized version of the Rainier City. In this case by architect J.E. Hoare in 1947. Light view privacy, towers in the park, these stunted little towers, however, they were only 3 stories tall. The parks, there was no park in Regent Park despite the name, there were parking lots. And so here's the transformation underway. And this is actually phase 2 of Regent Park, where you had a building that was considered the ultimate in contemporary design with skip-stop elevators modeled on the Marseille block by Le Corbusier. And so by the end of the 20th century, this was a failed promise. You can see what the place looked like in the lower right. However, the community, and this was a really interesting discovery, it had become a major immigrant reception area. And curiously enough, the population in Regent Park was almost identical to the population in St. Jamestown, which started life at around the same time, just up the street on Parliament Street, as market rental buildings, those towers, for young, sophisticated singles and couples in the business community in Toronto, and ended up housing also the same multi-generational immigrant families living in overcrowded situations as in Regent Park, but with really strong community cohesion. So I ended up with some colleagues in a very quick but deep exercise, working with the community, going essentially with no plan, with a blank sheet of paper and with a strong endorsement of the head of Toronto Community Housing, to first hammer out a kind of constitution for what this would be. What would be the key principles guiding this revitalization? Because it was clear, without the support of these thousands of tenants living in Toronto community housing, this would go nowhere. And additionally, without the support of the surrounding neighborhoods. So we actually brought in business people from Parliament Street, residents from Cabbagetown, as well as the tenants in Regent Park, and we hammered out these 12 principles. Key among them was the right of return. So people who were in the 2100 rent geared to income units would be guaranteed an opportunity to come back. But the most important thing was what was not an easy decision, was to get people to come to the realization that what they really wanted to be was not any kind of separate enclave at all, but to be a normal Toronto neighborhood, to have all the best attributes of the neighborhoods surrounding them, including a fine grain of streets and blocks to be connected on all sides, to have shops in the neighborhood, to have services, amenities, and some interesting discussions occurred. For example, parents whose kids had never had to cross a street, because there were no streets in these 2 large superblocks. They only had to cross parking lots. So the idea of kids having to learn to look both ways was something new, because their schools were on the site as well, and the playgrounds were on the site as well. So this was a really fascinating exercise. And eventually it led to a plan which couldn't be more simple. It was taking the 2 large superblocks on the 69 acres and creating 24 little city blocks following a Jane Jacobs precept of frequent intersections, small blocks, extending all the surrounding streets 360 degrees into the neighborhood, and introducing a park, a 6-acre park on Dundas Street where there had been no park, and a connected web of green spaces and opportunities for commerce to come into the neighborhood, and so on. And the plan that emerged for the revitalization process, and I'm using plan in the broadest sense, depended on all of these elements. It wasn't just creating the physical master plan, the tenant relocation plan to minimize disruption to people's lives, the environmental sustainability plan, the social development plan, which I can't emphasize too much and which I'll actually spend most of my time talking about, the implementation strategies, and the integration with the larger context were all key parts of the effort. We had remarkable community meetings where we had whispering translation in 7 languages. It was one of the most inspiring experiences I have ever had in all the years that I've been working on these kinds of projects. These communities from all different parts of the world actually really pulled together around the shaping of the principles and the goals that they wanted to pursue, and the clarity of their desire for a better future for their kids, for their families, for the kinds of opportunities they were looking for was really very impressive. We engaged young people from the community, often high school students, who were able to act as translators to go and sit at people's kitchen tables between the meetings that we held to explain some of the ideas. We gave them training and so on, and they became key intermediaries in these conversations. So in composing the physical plan, again, in keeping with simplicity and with not marking this as an unusual place with the idea that it was really invisible mending, we drew on building types that the industry in Toronto could handle very well, and we were composing with those types. So it was a combination of row houses, mid-rise, and these small point block towers, but spreading the towers around throughout the fabric with the idea that having the diversity of built form would actually enable us to have the social diversity that we were looking for. Having many different living arrangements and tenure arrangements was really critical to the notion of mix. We were fortunate in this case, and this is true of many of the Toronto community housing sites, that because we went through the shift, which you saw before in the case of Vancouver, where we used to have this phenomenon called inner city poverty. We had it too. Now we have, of course, suburban poverty. But at the time, a lot of these projects ended up in the heart of that pre-war city, and Regent Park sits literally a walk away from Yonge Street, from Ryerson University, from the Athletes Village, which has the cursor working here, yeah. So the new Athletes Village for the Pan Am Games is just a few blocks away. All the work on the waterfront is a few blocks away. So this is a highly strategic location. It's connected to several streetcar lines. It's really in a good place to actually do what we were attempting to do. So a quick snapshot by the numbers. The rent geared to income units, there were 2,083. The vast majority of them are being replaced on the site, and another 266 in the immediate vicinity. We're adding new social housing in the form of affordable rental units, both on-site and in the vicinity. This is something which didn't exist before, trying to address the gap between public housing and where the first condo purchasers pick up. There's a gap in income, and we wanted to fill that gap. And that, by the way, was something that was not anticipated originally. It evolved later on. The market units, 5,400. So unlike, you may be familiar with something called Hope 6 in the US, which was a revitalization of public housing projects in large cities, and what they typically did was to reduce the densities. We're actually dramatically increasing the densities to be similar to the kinds of neighborhoods that are forming elsewhere in Toronto. The project began in 2005. It was seen as a 15 to 20-year project. It will actually be done faster because the take-up is much greater than people anticipated on the market side. The size I'd mentioned, 69 acres. What has been the most extraordinary thing is the arrival of all these great facilities that I'm going to describe in more detail, something called the Daniel Spectrum, which is an arts and culture building and organization that's become a hub of the community. The Aquatic Center, which is the best indoor swimming facility in Toronto. The Regent Park, of course, which didn't exist. A new Regent Park athletic grounds, which came after the initial plan. It was a modification. And contrary to the advice we got from retail consultants, at the outset that we would have great difficulty getting retail here. We've had a big grocery store. We have a bank. We have a Tim Hortons, which is a very important, not my favorite usually, but I love this Tim Hortons. Drugstore, and now all the buildings on the main arteries are all being populated with retail. There's a waiting list of retailers who want to come in, and a really successful campaign to give jobs to young people in Regent Park. So I will talk about that as well. Just some quick snapshots of the master plan. Again, you can see how simple it is deliberately in order to enable it to evolve and to take on new ideas, new uses, new thoughts as things evolve. So here the color coding just speaks to the different building types, and you can see how dispersed it is. The idea is that the rent geared to income units and the various forms of social housing and the market units, whether condo or rental, would be dispersed in a way that nobody would know which was which, and all built to the same architectural quality, and that indeed has been the case. Very strong emphasis on a green public realm plan and on the park creation, including the big central park, and number 2 there, the creation of a park at Nelson Mandela School, which had formerly been the schoolyard, and connecting those with a pedestrian street. So this was our aspirational view of where we thought commerce might come, and we were right and the experts were wrong. So we made provision for that, which included high floor-to-ceiling heights for the ground floors and sufficient depth for real retail to occur in those spaces. This was all about getting streets that were amenable to walking and cycling. And one of the problems we've had with the amalgamation of Toronto is the imposition of suburban standards for rights-of-ways, turning radii, width of streets, lanes, and so on. So we had great fights, but with the support of the local councillor and the housing authority, we went so far as engaging insurance underwriters, not just transportation engineers, but we went all the way up the food chain to insurance underwriters to have a fight on the council floor with the fire chief, which we won, over getting the size of streets that we wanted to achieve here, because they were similar to streets throughout the rest of downtown. So the plan also consisted of a series of these cross-sections that really focusing on relationships between ground floor building and streets and the distribution of spaces within the rights-of-way. So these are snapshots around the plan. We created a set of urban design guidelines which were deliberately flexible, again, focusing on critical relationships, not being overly prescriptive, not falling into the trap of thinking we could predetermine all of the built form, but the quid pro quo was an agreement, and I should have mentioned this before, with the master developer who was shortly engaged, turned out to be an extraordinary company called the Daniels Corporation, which actually cut its teeth doing social housing. So it had great experience in this area, also a very successful developer in private market housing, strong roots in the arts community. Many of those characteristics turned out to be extremely important in making this a success. But the quid pro quo would be that the master developer would use different architects, and among the best architects and landscape architects for the different buildings, and there would be a dialogue with those designers as the buildings were created. So just some snapshots of where we anticipated the changes occurring. This is on Parliament Street, on Dundas Street, the new park. This is all before the plan, the character of those neighborhood streets. And this very important idea was a design review committee created as we began the project in 2005, which included representation, a peer group of architects and landscape architects and designers who have, some of the best have volunteered and continue to volunteer to serve on this, along with community members, people from city planning, people from the housing agency, and in a very informal setting, which is different from many other design review panels, able to have extended conversations multiple times over every building, every public space that's being designed. And the mandate of this group, because of its great success, has now been extended from Regent Park to all of the portfolio of Toronto Community Housing. So we're looking at all the transformational projects and every piece of it. And I've been fortunate enough to serve on this committee and continue to serve on it for the last 10 years. And everyone who has been a member has actually volunteered to continue their membership. We recently had that opportunity for a turnover, and everyone who was currently a member, we're adding some new people, but everyone who was on has decided to stay on. The terms of reference I've sort of described. We review the projects from the earliest stages to as we move into design development and even into detailed design. And the developers appear along with the designers, not a lawyer to be seen, which is, of course, makes the conversations much easier. And it's very cooperative, and I think most of the people who've appeared, if not all, before this panel would say it has actually helped to make their projects better. There was from the outset a commitment to a minimum of LEED Gold for all the buildings, which was more than what was being asked of private development, and it has now gone beyond that to a new Toronto Green Building Standard, which exceeds LEED Gold. So we originally had 6 phases. The phases have been accelerated because of the market take-up. Daniels did something very unusual in terms of breaking rank with traditional developer practice in Toronto, which was to sell off plans. So when you'd sold 70% of your condo units, roughly, you would go and get your financing and start to build. Where you see phase 1, what we did is we had the DNA of the whole project. So we had the mix that we were talking about in terms of market housing, social housing for different categories of social housing, seniors, families. We had the commerce, we had the grocery store. And Daniels went ahead and actually built the market building completely before they went to market, because they wanted to demonstrate the quality of the building, and it turned out to be a very successful move because they sold out almost immediately, including the local councillor who now lives in the project. So this is that first phase, which you see there, and you can see the checkerboarding of market and assisted housing in different forms. In yellow, something called the Christian Resource Center, which was not part of the Toronto Community Housing portfolio, elected to join us and build their own new building, which I'll show you in a short time. This is what it looks like three-dimensionally. And these were the buildings as they came before us. These were the images that were presented to the design review panel for some of these early buildings. Here's the grocery store at that key intersection where 2 streetcar routes cross at Parliament and Dundas. There, of course, was never any food shopping in this whole area except for a tiny, overpriced convenience store. The townhouses are identical for the RGI units, and for the market units, you cannot tell the difference. And to this day, I don't know. When I walk through the project, I have to remind myself to look at a map to actually remember which is which. This is one of the newer market buildings. And this is the first building. My wife, Etty, who's sitting here standing right in front of that building. And there's some really interesting innovations in these buildings. Where the ground floor lobbies occur, there are children's playrooms, there are computer rooms for the teenagers and others in the building to use. On lower roof levels, because people growing their own food was a big deal. There were community gardens, so there are roof terraces with raised beds for the tenants to raise their own fruits and vegetables, and those are associated with laundry rooms and places to look after the kids. So there are a lot of things here in terms of raising young families that paradoxically you don't find in condo buildings. So it's now becoming sort of, people are starting to realize that for child-friendly buildings, these actually beat out the private sector. There you see an example of the site office, which doubles as a meeting place And this is a practice that I think you're using in Vancouver, where you have the models of all the new projects that come along. You use them in planning applications in City Hall. Well, here they appear and they populate the model one by one so people can see the relationships, and they can also see in these plastic envelopes ghosting in what's yet to come in the master plan. So here's the main part of what I have to say, and it starts with a quote from Jane Jacobs: "The best plans are those that liberate other people's plans." And so what really has happened with this is, from the basic plan that I've described to you, the seeds of social cohesion for the neighborhood were planted and have been nurtured. So this is where the shift from the home, the house in terms of your symposium, to the neighborhood becomes so important. So all of these things that you see emanating from the plan, and I'm going to describe them one by one, were things that were not anticipated by and large in the original planning effort back in the early 2000s. We had the basic plan, and because the plan started to bear fruit and to be successful, many of these other things arrived as people responded to the opportunity. So I mentioned the Christian Resource Center. This was a homeless shelter, and they provided meals for indigent people on the streets of Toronto. And they actually got their own funding, and they stepped in and built this beautiful new building, expanding their facilities. They tied into the green space network that we were providing. And you can just get a sense of the quality of this space. It's also used for other community events that are beyond their own program. There's the wonderful person who runs the kitchen on the lower right. And on the left is something which I think is something we in Canada should be very proud of. Here's a Christian Resource Center that is sponsoring a Muslim welfare center, providing meals to both those communities in the same facility. And there are umpteen examples of this going on. We take it for granted, not so common in other parts of the world. This speaks to a whole range of things called social purchasing, which have gone on since, building community capacity. And these are really the keys to success in doing mixed income places. And what's interesting about Regent Park is not just looking at it sui generis in its own terms, but what's replicable here, what can be applied to the city fabric generally, not only on these sites owned by Toronto Community Housing, but on other sites where we're wanting to do mixed income housing. And I have to tip my hat in passing to the St. Lawrence neighborhood done under Mayor David Crombie back in the 1970s, which wasn't a transformation, it was a from scratch mixed income neighborhood from which we took many lessons. So employment strategy, it's not just about housing, it's about jobs. So we brought in the City of Toronto with its storefront employment center, social services division. We developed job creation partnerships with George Brown College, with the Daniels Center for Learning, which brought in university level courses free in that first building that was built by top professors at several of the local universities, and I'll speak to that again, and a whole variety of subjects, evening courses that were very well attended, working with the various commercial and retail partners who all employ local residents, particularly young, with something called Artscape, which is an arts organization that provides studio spaces and a variety of facilities for artists, the Paintbox Bistro, which is a music venue, and cafe, which is involved with George Brown on the culinary side. All of the construction operations on the site, all of the contractors and subcontractors are bringing young people from Regent Park into their apprenticeship programs and helping them get their credentials in the construction trades. So 760 jobs directly created and a lot of indirect jobs for people who live and work in the community. Here's the Paintbox Bistro, and now a thriving catering business serving downtown. This is a for-profit social enterprise, training people to become chefs, to run restaurants. It has a great live music program. We and everybody else who loves jazz in the city go there for their weekend concerts, which are amazing. So it's something that really serves the whole population. And people who go through this program end up with a food handler certificate, and they have launched these additional businesses. Regent Park Women and Families Quilting Group, this took advantage of a lot of the skills from this extraordinarily diverse group of women coming from different countries who came together to form a collective and turn this into a business where they use their skills, and among other things, they provide really successful tote bags from recycled coffee bean burlap bags for events all over the city. And this has become its own kind of cottage industry. This is the Center for Learning that I've mentioned. University of Toronto, Ryerson University, George Brown College, all have professors who come pro bono in the evenings to give these very popular courses, and as well as learning circles, storytelling, and so on. Everything is free of charge. This is the centerpiece of the whole community, the Arts and Cultural Center called the Spectrum. 60,000 square feet. It's a nonprofit community cultural hub. 7 innovative cultural organizations are there, including the Center for Social Innovation, Artscape, the Regent Park Film Festival, which is a very successful venture, the Art Heart Community Center, Pathways to Education. I'm going to touch on all of these. The Regent Park School of Music, Collective of Black Artists, COBA, Native Performing Arts. They all occupy space in this building, along with some of the best performance venues in the city, indoors and outdoors, where other groups come and rent the space for events on a weekly basis. Lots of opportunities for local artists, and there's no shortage of talent in this community, and I'm getting a warning, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. School of Music, which predated the revitalization but has expanded its facilities, one of the best music schools for group and individual lessons in the city. Pathways to Education, which picks up kids in high school and has had extraordinary results in terms of increasing the number of kids who go on to post-secondary education, a 300% increase in participation. This Regent Park Focus Youth Media Center, which is amazing. It occupies about 5,000 square feet, and young people do TV shows, they make movies, they have a radio show, they do all kinds of media things. They're extraordinarily talented. There's a show coming from Regent Park called Radio Regent, which is really terrific. I've appeared on the show being interviewed sometimes, which is really fun. Food and agriculture, an incredibly important part of meeting the needs of these families. So the opportunities for these community gardens on rooftops and on the ground throughout the site. A farmer's market which combines food grown on the site and local farmers who come on a frequent basis to the site. The Nelson Park Mandela School, which now has become a magnet not only for people from Regent Park, but from the surrounding communities, given the quality of the programs they have for elementary school kids. A new birthing center, which is opened on Dundas Street, again serving a broader population. The Community Health Center, which existed before, which has now expanded its facilities in all areas of health. The Aquatic Center, which is this incredible swimming pool, which again draws from the whole east end of the city and beyond. One of the latest things is a new sports facility done in partnership with Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, which includes a cricket pitch, which reflects the demographics of the area. Affordable home ownership. These are new programs introduced despite the lack of provincial and federal programs, which are innovations of our master developer, which have been incredibly successful, dealing with assisting people with a second mortgage, and I could go into more detail. A plethora of residents associations that link people who are both receiving social assistance and those who are not. And this really speaks to the health and vitality of this community. So some quick images of days in the life at Regent Park to give you a sense. And there's a website where you can see all the new projects as they're coming along, get information. These are some recommendations, and I'm going to steal a few minutes because I think it's worth saying this. This comes from Mitchell Cohen, who's the president of Daniels, offering some advice to the mayor, the premier, and with a federal election on the horizon as to some of the things that could be done to advance on the affordable housing front. So these affordable home ownership programs are something that they have pioneered, which are very successful. Using financial tools as incentives, manipulating property taxes that could be waived, development charges and other municipal fees, and finally, as the Premier has mused, inclusionary zoning or some broad across-the-board method of ensuring that we take advantage of the development momentum to get affordable housing throughout the city. My own thoughts quickly on what makes this successful. Sustained engagement before, during, and after, simple, flexible plans that can evolve and take on new opportunities, making complete neighborhoods in all senses, age, tenure, income, the value of radical mix, including employment, shopping, everything that you can imagine, cultural uses on the site, getting at the in-between incomes, the gap between the fully subsidized housing and the market housing, erasing the boundaries with the surrounding neighborhoods, invisible mending, the quality of design but not marking the area as special or different from what's around it, having many things on the site like the Aquatic Center or the Spectrum or the Paint Box that draw people from the larger community to be on the site in a completely unself-conscious, informal way, and a very strong role of arts and culture. And I'm going to now end by showing you a little video done by two people, a 15-year-old poet named Mustafa, who grew up in Regent Park, and a jazz musician originally from Nigeria who also lived in Regent Park named Thompson Egbo, and supported by Daniels. And I think this tells far more eloquently than I will ever be able to do what's going on here.
Once close to every chance, now an opportunity to enhance from the spectrum of open gates, experience, learn and innovate. Regent Park, a home to the arts, hidden in hearts and active in minds. Creative gifts manifest and you'll find open, and not just your eyes to depict the beauty in the park often sheltered in lies. Looking to find a place to shelter artistic minds, to grasp the talents unheard, talent they've blurred, talent they've left behind, to replace with breaking news of breaking hearts, and wrap with caution, take time and time and time again. If only they knew the park is filled with hearts that beat for each other. It's just been redefined, but as it redesigns, the beating will be clear and recombined. Emphatic, roaring, peace of heart, peace of mind, peace of heart, pieces intertwined. As it redesigns, it will show the bright colors splattered against brick walls, damp with tears, colors that come alive when light skies disappear. Then let the art touch your heart, heart. Children that sing louder than gunshots, sounds that ring louder than sirens, echoing through the park, through Somali tongues to music, into Regent Park School of Music, lifting parts of broken hearts out of fear. Voices that empower, that touch not the skin but what lies in here. So hear, but not just with your ears, to listen to the stories of stories often left unclear. Open the doors to Regent Park's Film Festival. Lights, cameras and reactions, golden sparks of interaction. Lights, cameras and attractions from all parts of the city. All we asked for was your heart and not your pity. All we asked for was your heart and not your pity. Be the change in the center of a social innovation. Watch every office turn into a foundation of inspiration. Hot desks of motivation as they smoothen the globe. Watch the new world unfold from youth engagement to poverty. Watch veiled eyes unroll. And clear your mind before you enter native art performing arts. Let the soles of your feet feel our mother's breaths in the ground as friction makes a sound, resounding, nature's gifts abounding. Feel as they teach spiritual fundamentals. Native arts main credentials, it's the earth we live on, so celebrating their culture should be essential. And dance into Toba's open doors, West African style. Let the beat of the drums harmonize with the beat of your soul and let it travel miles. And even if you're spiritually drained as you dance, just smile. Smile till you can forget sadness and laugh at anger. Until you can look into the eyes of anyone as a future brother and not a stranger. Invest in relationships, you don't need to be a banker. Send your salams to a Muslim, go play dice with a gangster. Redefine stereotypes and send that to the news anchor. Don't judge anyone, it's a small world and we're all neighbors. See everyone as one. Let that be our new culture, along with our own, and let us hone a new art of hearts that have grown. Once close to every chance, now an opportunity to enhance from a spectrum of open gates. Experience, learn, and innovate.
So we still have some time for questions. Thanks so much for that. And I think those of us from Vancouver can't help but be struck by the contrast between this and Little Mountain. Yes, our own social housing project built in 1954, which the province sold in 2007, emptied everybody out in 2009, and is still sitting as a vacant lot with no one quite clear on what's going to happen next. So lots of interesting questions, I'm sure, from the audience, including how you define affordable rental. But I'll go to the audience here.
Two related questions. The first was, is there any sense of what the rent differential was for the people who were able to return post-revitalization? Did they see an increase in the rent, and is that a concern?
As far as I know, the same, they were not paying more for the new units. And whatever the formula was that was defining the rent geared to income remained the same.
And is there any sense of how many might move from assisted rental to being on that first rung of home ownership from that same?
I don't have numbers, but I'm told by Daniels, with whom I'm in touch, that there's been a fair amount of take-up, that this community has turned out to be so terrific that people don't want to leave. So the typical pattern that would have happened before, which is when people had the prospects of their lives improved, they might have moved out to the suburbs to seek home ownership. People are really trying to stay here, and so there was a pretty significant demand for the affordable home ownership and for the affordable rental. And a lot of those people are people who are former public housing tenants.
Yes.
Is there any take-up of cooperative housing, or is it all social, like,
There hasn't been, I mean, what's interesting about Daniels is they cut their teeth in the co-op sector back when we had the programs, which is why I think they had a lot of the expertise to deal with this in a way which is as sophisticated as they have. What we're trying to do is reinvent basically the affordable housing sector in the absence of strong government support by coming up with all these interesting partnerships and financial mechanisms. But it's not exactly an answer to your question, but what's happening is that more and more different forms of tenure are emerging. Like one of the most interesting things that happened is that a for-profit seniors housing group for middle-income people has just purchased one of the sites because they want their members to be able to be next to the Spectrum, next to the Aquatic Center, and to be part of this community. So like St. Lawrence Housing before it, what was fascinating about St. Lawrence Housing when it was done, which had co-ops and had the full spectrum of housing, private developers would come in near St. Lawrence and call themselves St. Lawrence, even though they weren't, because it was seen as that good. And something similar is now happening with Regent Park.
Andy, you had a question?
Ken, thank you for a wonderful presentation, and I think one that really explores both the connection between place-based and people-based planning and development. And I think that that's really something that's to be deeply applauded and something we can learn a lot. I guess my question actually doesn't have to deal with that, but it actually has to deal with how Toronto recently has had a rather interesting, colorful mayoral relationships. And I'm curious how the relationships between governments and governmental regimes locally, provincially, and federally has kind of come out to kind of affect Regent Park.
We could spend an afternoon on that, but let me say briefly that politically this project had tremendous support from the MPP, who has gone on to be a cabinet minister, had tremendous support from the local councillor. David Miller, who was mayor, was supportive as well, although he wasn't deeply involved. Federal government, not so much. Not doing anything harmful, but not doing anything helpful either. But I think the question that you're raising speaks to some of the things that were brought up in Margaret's presentation before about tying these kinds of strategies to our three interlocking provincial policies. The Big Move, which is our regional transportation strategy, Places to Grow, which is trying to direct development to transit supportive areas, and the Greenbelt, which is defining where that growth goes. And this is why the Premier now starting to say that, you know, you talked about housing affordability being your #1 crisis. We would probably state it more broadly and say polarization, of which housing is a component, is the #1 crisis. So all of those things contribute to polarization, and making sure that we get affordable housing, mixed income housing, to tie in with Places to Grow, I think is the key.
Other questions? Yes.
What do you say to developers or people that feel social housing or subsidized housing should be built as cheaply as possible and look cheaply so they move on and don't become dependable on society or taxes?
Find something else to do. No, I'm being facetious, but actually our best developers, and Daniel's is right up there, but there are some other major developers who've learned so much from Daniel's success, who are now taking on other projects like this. Some in the center of the city, and some of them oriented to transit in the inner suburbs, who are trying to apply these lessons. And I think what this demonstrates, it gives the lie fundamentally and finally into the idea that you can't mix income successfully. It really works.
Gord, and then you, and then you, and then Michael.
Any impact on St. Jamestown? What's happening there? You might want to explain.
Sure. There's a parallel effort which has a lot of similarities to this called Tower Renewal, which is something that began under David Miller. It actually started with a thesis done by an architecture student at the University of Toronto, which is looking at that generation of 1,000, roughly, of these towers that were built in the 50s and 60s, the slabs, essentially, and they all are surrounded by large amounts of open space in the form of parking lots where there aren't that many cars anymore, because a lot of the people living in those buildings don't have cars. And so tower renewal is about doing an environmental retrofit of those buildings, plus giving planning incentives so that they can build mid-rise and lower scale housing around them, plus use the ground floors of the buildings and the surrounding area for commerce, so that you can get the characteristics of whole neighborhoods occurring in those places. And there are now some pilots that are emerging working with the private sector, and St. Jamestown would be a prime candidate for that.
Go ahead.
Sure. I'm curious a little bit about the relationship between the increase in density and the market housing being introduced to the overall funding and viability of the project. Was that a factor given right from the start, or is it something that evolved as the process of planning went on?
It evolved. At the beginning, the amount of market housing and the built form was obviously to do with the financial viability of the model. But as it turned out to be so successful, the developer brought forward some amendments to our design review panel, to the local community, to the city, saying, we can actually increase the densities without compromising the quality and make it more like some of the other neighborhoods that are emerging. And people had a really hard look at that because we didn't have to. We could have said the rules are the rules and just stick to them. But actually with unanimous support, there were some amendments to what we call the official plan and the zoning bylaw to allow for some of those increases in density. Some redistribution of density, like that cricket pitch that I showed you, was not originally in the plan. And so the basic plan is still more or less the same. They're not radical changes, but there has been an acceptance of some increased density seen as beneficial and not compromising the original qualities of the plan.
And that increased density is all in the market sector, or is it a mix?
Well, it's a mix because the affordable rental and the affordable home ownership are also part of that. They were not, originally it was just going to be rent geared to income units and condo units.
Back there, and then Michael, and then I'm going to have to call it quits so that we can eat, so people don't keel over here. So sorry about that.
I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to tenant relocation, and if the people who are like, moving into the RCI units are the people who like, originally lived there, or a little bit more like the relocation of there.
Where are people coming from?
Yeah, like where are people like coming from who are moving into the new units, right? Like are they from the communities who were living there before?
I would say they're very largely people who are coming back. Some people have been able to be relocated on the site. The whole idea has been minimum disruption, but there was a need for some people to move off-site and then come back. So there's some attrition, obviously, over the time that a project like this takes place, just natural attrition, but there's been a pretty high percentage of people who've elected to come back.
Great. And Michael, closing.
Kind of double-barreled. What would you?
Yeah, he's asking for the whole row, I think.
Okay.
That's this out. What would you like to see the province doing and the feds doing, given that they aren't doing any, but what would you like? And what should they not do? And what would you do differently?
Well,
Okay, I'm going to say you have 45 minutes to answer that. Yes. Then I'll cut it off.
let me start by just speaking to the principles and then there are a variety of means of achieving these principles. I think there has to be an acknowledgement, that the market is not going to reach significant numbers of people who have housing needs. We in Canada used to be very clear about saying that. We lost track of that. And so I think we need to reanimate Central Mortgage and Housing, Canada Mortgage and Housing. We have to reanimate the provincial agencies that were involved in the housing field, and we have to have a variety of programs. Secondly, I think a really important principle, which we once had in Ontario, was that the official plans, I don't know if you use the same terminology, the comprehensive plans of all the municipalities in the province should insist that there be a mix of housing wherever significant amounts of housing are built. And they should vary. If you're in North Bay versus Toronto, obviously it should be handled in a different way. But we used to do that. We used to get mixed income housing in all our suburban tract developments. And they were often in the form of co-ops or seniors housing or other kinds of housing. Again, Mike Harris did away with that. I think if we had that support, and if we used those financial instruments that Mitchell Cohen, the president of Daniels, was speaking to, creatively in terms of development charges and taxes, we could get a lot of affordable housing, in our case, occurring in those first-ring suburbs by using financial incentives, what the Americans call empowerment zones, to get the housing to occur where we want it to occur on those transit lines that are being built in the suburbs.
Okay.
And what would you do differently?
What would I do differently?
Yeah, what would you do differently about this project? Looking back on it, what would you change there?
That's a really interesting question. I would answer it by saying, okay, a proxy. I think what we did right, which has enabled the learning, the feedback loops, is to be as flexible as we were. Because so much of the really good stuff that has happened, we could not have imagined at the time. And if we had created rules that were more rigid or harder to change, we probably wouldn't have been able to take advantage of those opportunities. So thinking of the project as something that can absorb change and is open to partnerships, which is what all those things were that I described to you, enables it to be a living, learning neighborhood rather than the idea of having a fixed destination, which we didn't. So we just created this really simple plan and said it's almost like a piece of city that's going to evolve, and we're not sure exactly where it's going to end up, but let's let it live.
So that was very inspirational for us in Vancouver. I hope we get to tell a story like that someday. Waiting. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Ken Cameron wanted to.
Oh, okay. Thank you.